Hey Gems! Welcome to A Gem Forever, a podcast designed to keep things real, righteous, and relevant. I'm your host, Andrea, an educator and a Christian blogger. I desire to help others become the best version of themselves while realizing the gem they are within. Remember, gems have to be molded and shaped, so let's get to work and start applying some pressure. Hey, Gems! Welcome to episode 6 of the A Gem Forever podcast. I hope that you all are ready for another gem dropping conversation because I have a gem in the house. My boo Chanel is with me. I want to call her Dr. Chanel Clay, but she's not here just yet. But she is a lovely mental health professional who has so graciously agreed to speak to me this month in the month of May for mental health awareness in regards to mental health within the Black community. So I am going to let her introduce herself because I can't um, completely describe all her accolades. I wanted her to introduce herself in all her glory. So, Miss Chanel, take it away. Please introduce yourself. Tell us what you do, who you are, what you have been studying, all that good stuff before we delve into this very interesting conversation.
Thank you. So my name is Chanel Clay. I am a licensed professional counselor for Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, as well as a board certified telemental health therapist and a approved clinical supervisor. I am currently a doctoral candidate at Duquesne University, where I am studying counseling, education, and supervision. Oh, and I also work for Onyx Therapy Group, which is a Black-owned mental health agency located in Washington, D.C., Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, as well as Maryland.
Come on, Chanel. Listen, yes. Let me contain myself. You know I get excited. All right. All right. So, ma'am, what made you decide to become a counselor and take an active stance in the area of mental health?
So it's funny, actually, I wanted to be a lawyer. So
I can see that too.
yeah, I wanted to be a lawyer. I like to argue sometimes. I'm very, factual, right? Like very evidence based. And so I actually started like some of like the pre-law trainings as a high school student. And so one of the clauses for this, they used to have like night law for PG County, and I went and I enjoyed it. And then when it was my turn to serve as the prosecutor, I asked a lot of intuitive questions like, does this person have environmental resources? This is like a very learned behavior. Where did they get it from? And I remember the judge coming to me and say, hold on, can we stop? And ask me to come up to the front and was like, you're asking a lot of questions and you're actually helping the person's case versus like serving as the prosecutor. Like, what's up? And I think from that point on, it was kind of like a warning sign, like, you're more into the person's like behaviors, right? Versus like actually like prosecuting them and making sure that they serve time for it. And so eventually, of course, peer mediation and a whole lot of other high school things. But I also have a sibling that has autism. And so I've always been involved in mental health and disabilities. And so I learned very early about his disability, right? And very early about the logistics, right? Like paperwork and IEPs and things like that. So I'd always kind of had a notion about what it was like to be in the psychological field, and which led me to get my bachelor's from Delaware State University. Go Hornets! In psychology. And then after that, I actually took 2 classes that were in counseling, and I really loved those classes. I really enjoyed just learning the techniques and the theoretical orientations and everything that kind of came with the mannerisms of being in counseling, which then led me to get my master's in counseling education from Trinity. And then, of course, forward thinking now into my doctoral program. So I've kind of just been in the field alone for counseling, probably for maybe the last maybe 8 years or so, 8 or 9 years or so, working as either a doing clinical placement or either as like a pre-licensed counselor, and then all the way up into counselor and assistant clinical director for Onyx now. So for a while.
I think for as long as I've known you, and I feel like I've known you for a
For a
while,
while.
and I never knew that you initially were going to be in law. I never knew that.
Yeah, yeah.
I never knew that.
That can always be my backup plan. I'm young enough to switch. I'm
It's
just
not
kidding.
going to be, but that. But I can see that. I can see that. Yeah, I
Yeah,
really can see that. But I'm glad you went the other direction because this is more fitting for you.
yeah.
So, if you don't mind giving us a description of mental health, for those who may not be aware of all it encompasses, because I think it's a term that is kind of thrown around,
Hmm.
but people may not truly understand what all it encompasses and may not have just a true definition of what mental health actually is. So if you don't mind kind of just describing that for us.
Yeah, sure. So, mental health is kind of thrown around quite frequently, right? To describe so many different things, but mental health, holistically, right? And I say holistically because it doesn't just deal with your mind, right? So, mental health is ideally the state of wellness in regards to your emotional state, your psychological state, and your social well-being. So it impacts a variation of things. It doesn't just impact, um, some type of functionality, if you will, but it impacts productivity, right? So if we're not feeling well, if we are not feeling up to par, say we have depressive symptoms or we're depressed, right? We're more prone to sleep. We're more prone to do things that will comfort us, right, and provide us some level of comfort versus the things that we naturally would feel. I guess like the push to do, right? So sometimes we don't take a shower. Sometimes we don't wash our clothes, and then on the flip end, maybe we just don't feel like being attentive, right? Or we're not able to be attentive. Let me clarify. So it affects productivity. It also affects how we engage with others, right? So have you ever like had a friend who is normally very upbeat, right, and then all of a sudden maybe they stop hanging out with you guys as frequently, maybe they stop being focused, maybe they stop calling or texting, right? So that level of change when it comes to engagement with others. But then it also impacts the choices that we make, which is probably the third thing, and one of the most vital things, right? So if we're making a rational decision, right, sometimes our mental health also impacts that. So sometimes we will say, well, I'm making this choice because I feel comfortable making this choice without considering some of the reactive situations that come from you making that choice, right? So being very impulsive, making decisions that might not necessarily benefit us or benefit other people. So all of those things in compilation could be a part of your mental health.
Good to know. That's good. That encompasses a lot of different things that I don't think that we on a I guess general level really think about, because I think oftentimes, like when you gave the example of like your friend who your friend who is normally consistent, and when that person stops being consistent, I think oftentimes we kind of take it personally and we think that, oh, it maybe it has something to do with us, but it sounds like from listening to you that 9 times out of 10 it may just be something going on within their life and something that has been impacting their mental health that has kind of caused them to stray away
Mm-hmm.
from us a bit. And so I think it's good to be very mindful of those type of situations, which made me think of another question, but I'll hold on to that and I'll ask it towards the end. It made me think about something that I saw that made me think about the situation
Well,
like that's going on
maybe
in the
you're
world
not.
now.
Yeah, maybe you and I are thinking of the same thing actually, which is
Uh-huh.
you said that it actually resonated with me about this post that I saw,
The
which
post
was
about the pandemic, right?
yes.
Yeah, so we can talk about it now because we were thinking the same thing.
Okay.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah. So in regards to COVID, right? So in regards to COVID-19, we have this. So in explanation of the post, if we're talking about the same post, there was a post that was made about if you don't hear from a person in COVID or Corona, right? That basically like you should either, cut them off or they weren't ever your friend. And I think that
Mhm.
that is kind of like the ideology that courses negativity, right? Because what happens is that we are in a pandemic, which means that there are multiple people being impacted, including your friend, including your relative. So some of the things that we do on a day-to-day interaction, such as sending a text, calling somebody, engaging with somebody, are
Mhm.
now not necessarily as easy as we would like, right? Because we're all being impacted because of the pandemic. Our feelings, our emotional well-being are being impacted. So something as simple as you considering a text message as a form of communication could potentially be harm for that person. So as a reminder, COVID or Corona is not a time to test people's relationships, right? Not the time to test people's love languages, not the time to engage with people on a conditional basis, right? Something called contingency patterns is the ideology that someone provides love or provides a specific behavior only if. So if then. So if your friendship and your relationship with people is contingent, right? So if it's contingent, it doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship is as healthy as you would ideally want it to be, right? So if you're saying that, oh well, my relationship with XYZ is contingent if they send me a text or a call, that's not positive behavior, right? And that's not how we uphold some of our relationships, because we as people are not always at 100, and sometimes we're not even at 50. So some
Mhm.
of our expectations need to also be changed or altered, right? In consideration of COVID.
Thank you, girl. You see, look, kindred spirits, great minds think alike. Because as soon as
Yeah.
you said it, I was like, oh, that quote from Instagram that I keep seeing.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's exactly. That's a, thank you for talking about that, Chanel. Because I think it was a really good point to bring up, like you said about in this season when we're going through a pandemic and every people are putting so much emphasis on, like you said, making relationships conditional in this season, and this is not the season for that. And I think I guess you can attest to this if you agree. I think also if you feel as though like someone isn't, reaching out to you in the fashion in which they have been, I think the bigger being the bigger person, and just being mindful of everything that you just said, being reaching out to that person to check on them yourself to make sure that they're not being negatively impacted by this pandemic. And if they are, just trying to figure out how you can support your friend instead of being like, oh, they haven't checked on me. So in this season, after this is over, I'm going to cut them off. Us not being that type of person, but reaching out and extending love and grace and kindness to people, especially during this time, just to make sure that they're okay, because we don't know how people are handling this type of situation and on what type of level they're handling it on.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So it takes nothing for us to be the person who reaches out. I think that, which kind of goes into the ideology of the strong friend, which is that we have a designated person that we rely on to be the person who reaches out, who connects us, right? Who makes us feel seen, right? And so sometimes that person needs the same level of attentiveness
Mhm.
that we ask of them. So yes, if you haven't heard from a friend or you haven't heard from a family member and you're wondering like, hey, like what's up with that person, right? Shoot them a text, give them a phone call, send them a FaceTime, send them an email, whatever way of communication that you feel is best. Go ahead and do that, right? Because that person may be impacted in a positive way by you actually reaching out. So yes, you have a absolutely good point.
Love. All right, so let's move on from the pandemic question. And I really wanted to have you on because I just got this idea about discussing mental health in regards to the Black community, and then you pinpointed that May, of course, is Mental Health Awareness Month, so this would be the perfect time to do it. So
Mhm.
my next question speaks to exactly that, and it is, why is understanding mental health important, especially in the Black community? And I asked that question because I feel like, just in regards to people that I know, relatives, friends, I think that at times mental health isn't really taken, I'm sorry, seriously in our community. And I think more so now it's being brought to a forefront and people are actually starting to take it seriously. But in regards to that question, why do you think understanding mental health is important, especially in our community?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, understanding mental health in general, right, is very important because, as I stated earlier, it impacts your emotional, psychological, and your social well being. So, to understand yourself holistically, right, and to understand the variations of you, and understand some of the way that you think and the way that you move, right, you have to come to a very good understanding about that. And so understanding mental health helps you understand why you make those executive decisions, helps you understand why you're feeling that way. It assists you in the productivity, assists you in the positive decision making. So it assists you on day-to-day interactions. And so it's best if we educate ourselves and provide ourselves the opportunity to know what mental health actually is. Now, as far as the Black community, right? So there, we can kind of like dig more deep into this, but the Black community itself is more susceptible, right, to have mental health. Over, I believe it was 60.8 or 62.8 million, right? Black or African American descent people had a diagnosis or something diagnosable within the last year, which means that that is a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that means that pretty much the person next to you could potentially have a mental health issue. Your grandma, your neighbor, your cousin, your auntie, you, right, can potentially have a mental health disorder. And so to understand us and how we engage with each other and the delicacy and the need that we need from one another, we need to also understand how it is to support. And so knowing what mental health is, knowing the inside and the out of mental health is very important, especially in our Black community. I think there has been a kind of like a separation of mental health in the Black community historically, right? Which is sometimes people will say, oh, that's like a white thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And normally used as a white thing in regards to an excuse, right? We see a lot of times when people have court cases and they'll say, oh, well, this person had depression and that's the reason why they killed like 7 people, right? Mm-hmm. So we associate it as a excuse, right? Versus ownership. And so we decide, or we associate it as a white thing, right? Or another nationality versus something that could be impacted in our homes. And that level of thinking has made us not want to understand mental health for what it is, but then also removing ourselves from the mental health stigmas too.
That's good. You could actually led into the my next question, which was why do you think mental health has been so neglected in the Black community? Do you think it's just from lack of understanding, or do you think there's more to it?
So mental health, sometimes when mental health is introduced to us, right? So historically, right, like we as Black people have not had a very good history when it comes to health. Let's just be clear, right? Mm-hmm. We have the Tuskegee testing, we have the Henrietta Lacks testing, right? So we've always been used experimentally, right, for people. And so our history about medicine, when it comes to us, medicine or anything that's health related, we become very anxious, right? We become very anxious and we don't become very receptive of it because of those things. And that's strictly understandable. A lot of the times as a Black therapist, I do have to kind of reiterate and to explain to my clients exactly what I'm doing, right? Like even if I have a notebook in front of them and I'm writing down notes, if it makes them uncomfortable, I'll explain to him the reason, he or she, the reason why I'm writing down the notes, because in some way, shape, form, or fashion, we have adopted being aware of what people could potentially use against us, mm-hmm. and being cognizant of the fact that people will use us experimentally. So, and then digging even deeper historically, right? Historically, we also were used experimentally. I mean, going all the way back into slavery, right? And so it has been neglected because the Black community may not necessarily be receptive to it. Mm-hmm. Mental health also sometimes in the Black community needs a couple of things that we don't necessarily like to admit. One of the things is that our home is not as legit or as fulfilling as we make it to be. I remember as a teenager and as a kid, my mom used to say, you don't mix the outside world with the inside world, right? She used to say that all the time. And it wasn't until I was older that this was kind of like her expectation of me setting a boundary where I don't allow other people to know what was going on inside of our house, right?
Mm-hmm.
That same ideology, whether you say inside world, outside world, or don't tell nobody what's going on in my house as a form of secrecy, has also been a reason why mental health has not been addressed, right? Because people who address their mental health in a clinical fashion sometimes have to admit that there may have been something wrong in their house or something wrong throughout their lives. And it doesn't mean that that person is broken and can never recover, right? It just means that this veil, right, that maybe somebody had put on in the family
Mm-hmm.
or put on in general does not exist. And so if that has been our norm, and that has been what we have found comfort in, then we don't feel comfortable, right? And we don't feel safe and we feel open and exposed. So it makes sense for the Black community to not necessarily be receptive to mental health right away because we have a lot of barriers that
Mm-hmm.
are in front of us that our intersectionality says, I don't necessarily know about mental health. You know, why should I trust you?
Mm-hmm.
And as a clinician, that's one of the things that we challenge, but we don't consider it as the challenge that's going to prevent someone from engaging in some level of clearance and wellness and healing, right? As a Black person and as a Black person who serves Black people.
So at that, I'm going to skip down a few questions because what you were saying just led me to one of the questions that I had. So you were talking about mental health barriers. In regards to that, like as a clinician, um, do you work like towards breaking those mental health barriers in communities of color, or and is there like a way that we like as people of color are able to kind of break down those mental health, those barriers in regards to mental health, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. So as a mental health provider, as a Black woman, right, who serves the majority of Black folks, right, in a sense, I'm already assistant in breaking down the barrier.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why is because in hindsight, historically, white males and white women have been our providers, right? And so when I come into whether it's the office at the press building or my office here in Pittsburgh, which is where I primarily service out of, I love to see people's faces when they recognize I'm a Black woman,
Mm-hmm.
especially if they are a Black client, right? Because sometimes these people have not seen my profile. They've only looked at my name on a sheet of paper somewhere, saw all the acronyms, saw what I specialize in, and signed up for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So upon faith, I recognize that they're putting their faith in me, which is very, very fulfilling on my part, but then it's also something that should not be taken lightly, right? So part of breaking the barrier is also having culturally competent or culturally aware clinicians that know the barriers that are already present and know how serious that their sincerity and their transparency is, right? And assisting that client along the way, right? And making them feel comfortable and feel like this is a place of healing versus a place of chastisement.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is education, right? I do a lot of psychoeducation with my clients. There's something called cognitive behavioral therapy, which basically taps into a client's thinking versus, thinking and their behaviors, right? So I think, therefore I am, in a sense, right? And so I know that if I'm asking them to do something and I'm not necessarily certain that they understand, I have no problem as a clinician explaining that to my clients and making sure that I'm patient enough for them to get what it is that they need to get to know how serious or to know how important it is for their wellness to be considered by me and to be considered by them most of all. So education is also another factor that helps people in communities of color to break down some of the mental health barriers. One of the actual outlier things that helps people break down barriers, and it's, this is what I tell people who say that celebrities and people who have high, I guess, like celebrity statuses are not that important. I can't tell you how many times somebody has come to me and said that a celebrity, so this celebrity went to counseling and that's the reason why I decided to check it out. So
Mm-hmm.
people speaking more frequently and openly, whether it's a celebrity or it's someone, your cousin or your auntie or whatever, not being ashamed and opening up that level of conversation. You're already doing justice now by doing this podcast, right? Which is someone may hear it and they may hear my response. They may even hear the questions that you ask and say, man, I've really been wanting to check out therapy, but this is kind of like the push that I needed. This is the education that I needed. This is the time that I needed, right? So a lot of the times it just also means exposure, right? And trusting someone who has been in therapy, who can give you the okay, the thumbs up, if you will. And we have a lot of celebrities, we have a lot of shows that are now tapping into therapy, right? Like Wale, shout out to him. Clearly, he's like, a PGDC native, but he's one of the ones who has been open about him going to therapy, right? And so some people are like, wow, like, does he really go to therapy? I mean, I believe him when he say he does, right? And so to watch him kind of manifest into a more focused person, right, is kind of proof at what the healing process looks like. Mm-hmm. So education, exposure, and finding clinicians of that have cultural awareness or of color are some of the arenas or some of the items that we use to break mental health barriers in communities of color.
That's good, Chanel. And it's like the way you explained it makes it like how you were saying, like, me doing this podcast is helping to break a mental health barrier. You don't think of something, as simple as that being a contributing factor to breaking down a barrier within the arena of mental health. And it's funny because yesterday I actually was at a friend's house. She invited us over. We had like a little small cookout. It was less than 10 people, so it was like 5 of us. But it was mainly like it was just cousins, and we were talking. I don't know how we even got on the subject, but we started. One of my cousins and I started talking about therapy, and my other cousin was saying that she just isn't really an advocate for it because she doesn't understand, how it will be beneficial, to her life. And so my cousin and I were just kind of breaking our experience down for her, and just kind of sharing, like, why I was telling her I went because of depression, and my other cousin was telling her, why she started to go because she's, a social worker. So of course, all the different things that she sees, she needed, and deals with, she just needed to talk to somebody in regards to it. And I was telling her that just being able to talk to a subjective person that, doesn't know me, I don't know them, I don't feel judged. I don't feel like I'm sitting down, and I'm not made to feel like, I'm not made to feel like my feelings are valid. I'm not made to feel like I'm crazy, but I can just like openly share with this person about these issues that I'm struggling with, and they can help me navigate it and give me strategies to kind of walk through life better than I was doing it before. And so we were just trying to explain it to her and just kind of make it understand. But of course, it was one of those situations where, I was like, we can talk all day, but it's one of those things where you kind of have to experience it for yourself. But just the fact that we were able to share our experience with her, and the fact that now that she, has family, who has actually walked this walk and has gone through therapy, hopefully, that will be something that breaks down the barrier for her to make her more open to, counseling in the future if that's something she so chooses to do.
Yeah. By you guys telling you your own, right, like, journey in regards to therapy. So, I always advocate for therapists to have therapists. I have a therapist. I have a male therapist, right? And I chose that therapist specifically for a area that I wanted to discuss more about. And so there are so many therapists too. And so this is kind of like a disclaimer. Finding a therapist is like finding a good pair of shoes. You ever been to, like, I don't know, I was about to say Shoe City, Lord have mercy. Been in a Nike store, New Balance store, whatever store that you gone to, right? And you go and you put on these shoes and you're like, man, these shoes look real good, but man, I need to probably, like, let me check out the other shoes before I make this purchase, because I really feel like I need to try on these other shoes. And then you try maybe the third pair. She's like, nah, I like these shoes way better than the first one, right? You're not immediately sold. So what people don't understand is that you are the consumer, right? And so just as you are to purchase a pair of shoes, you have the option of interviewing your counselor. A lot of people feel like they can't interview their counselor, therefore they feel like they don't have a level of control in the situation, and it makes them anxious, which then further makes them go through a level of irrational thinking or however it goes, right, where they talk themselves out of being in with the clinician, right, like being in counseling. So I would definitely advocate for her and for any other person interview your counselor. If that counselor is not willing to give you maybe a 10 or a 15-minute consult, or either talk to you via email, whatever the case may be, maybe that counselor doesn't serve you any justice. Or maybe that counselor doesn't provide you the level of certainty that you would like, and you move on to the next counselor. There's so many counselors, there's so many clinicians out here now that you don't have to just eat from one spoon at this point. So I would encourage her to, to try. There's so many different steps on getting a counselor. If you want me to talk more about that, I can. But she doesn't have to just stop right there. And I think that also is a barrier too, right? Which is that this is the end all be all. Once I make this email, once I make this phone call, I have to stick with this person. Not at all. And if you don't feel like you're receiving the treatment, you can always go to another counselor.
And I think that's what that's good that you brought that up, Chanel, because I think that also stops a lot of people who start going to counseling. It stops them from going back because they go and they sit down with the counselor, and the person may just not be a right fit for them, and they're like, oh, I knew this wasn't going to work for me, and they immediately back away, and they never go back instead of actually trying to go back out there and trying to find somebody who suits you and who fits you. It's just like you saying, kind of like, you're interviewing this person who's going to be an instrumental part of your life. So, it takes time to figure out if that person is going to mesh well with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you can talk about some steps later on.
Okay.
I heard you. So you answered like 3 questions in one, so I'm not going to waste time asking it. But this is one of the questions that I did want to ask. In regards to mental health and the Christian perspective. And you and I have had these conversation several times. But the question is, until recently, what do you feel has been the church's stance or a Christian perspective on mental health? And it follows up with, why do you think that is or was, and what do you believe has changed or is changing in regards to that?
Yeah, of course. So one of the things that strikes me immediately about being a clinician, and we do get a lot of these, a lot of emails, or we'll get talks about, why should I go see a therapist when I got God, right? So in clarity, just making the first line, which is that we in no way, shape, form, or fashion are trying to compete with God, right? God is God. And so we don't want to be God. And so I think that's kind of like where the confusion sometimes lies, right? Which is that I can only remember, God already said that you can't serve 2 masters, right? You're not serving me because technically you are the expert at your own counseling, if that makes sense. So I'm learning from you, right? It's kind of like I'm in the car and then and I'm giving you GPS directions realistically, right? But you have all of the control because you are the one who's driving. So when I think about being a mental health counselor and also a Christian in my own perspective, I think about Proverbs 11:14. And Proverbs 11:14 says that where there is no guidance, a people fall, but in abundance of counselors, there is safety. So in hindsight, the terminology counselors has already been associated to wise counsel this whole entire time. And so sometimes when people say, well, you can't have God and a counselor, you can have them both. And realistically, if your counselor is a very culturally competent counselor, they will ask you about your spirituality and incorporate it in there, right? I don't advertise myself to be a pastoral counselor because my background is in clinical mental health or counseling education and supervision. So my licenses and things are always in the more broadband area, right? I have expertise and I'm a certified school counselor and a whole lot of other stuff. However, I am a Christian, right? And so I do read the Bible, I do go to church, etc. You can have God and a therapist. God created therapists, part 1, right? And going back to the Proverbs quote, which is that when there is no guidance, a people fall, but in abundance of counselors, there is safety. Meaning that in an abundance of assistance, abundance of aid, because counselors ain't nothing but another word for aid. So we are here to help you, right? Help you reach your level of attainment, help you to reach whatever level of self-actualization that you feel that God would anoint and would acknowledge and would love, right? And God loves indifferently, right? So just like how God loves indifferently, we are also taught to love indifferently, right? So we are also taught to have a level of unconditional positive regard similar to God, right? And if you feel like your counselor does not provide that, then of course find you a new counselor. But the Christian stance has always been pick one, right? Because you can't serve two masters. It hasn't been until kind of like the uprising of the people who are now between their 30s and their 40s, right? Who recognize that the Bible quotes that we've been using to get by, such as, I know all of the plans that I have for you. That part, like, that reduces anxiety, or, pray and don't be anxious about nothing. All of the Bible terms that we have now identified that could potentially be cliche only in conversation of why we are feeling bad, and why we're feeling sad, and why we're feeling upset, and why we can't mourn and things like that. We're finding sometimes that they're not enough. So you can bring your Bible into a counseling session and have that clinician, and you can talk about Proverbs 11:14 and talk about the other Bible quotes that make you feel balanced, right? But the Bible can also be a part of your coping mechanisms. No one's saying that you have to pick either one. No one's saying that you have to completely erase your level of spirituality. And even if you're not Christian and you're listening to this and say that you are part of the Islamic faith, you can actually pick someone who actually specializes in the Islamic faith. You could pick someone who is of Catholicism. You can pick any person that you would ideally like, because that information sometimes is privy to you. So the Christian perspective has now been broadband because we have so many foot warriors now, right? Who are telling people that it's completely okay for them to have God and for them to have a therapist. One of the ones that comes to mind, and I met her at the Taraji P. Henson, Boris Henson Foundation inaugural conference last year, was Dr. Anita Phillips. She is awesome. She's the sweetest person. Oh my God, I'm so smitten by her. And I watched her talk very candidly about how she even vocalizes it and encourages it at her husband's church, right? And so she's not saying that a altar counselor is suffice, right, for some of these things, because an altar counselor is not trained in to deal with suicidal ideation, right? So there's a split difference. And so she makes that very clear and very transparent. I think a lot of the new ministers, the new people of faith have been very transparent in going to a therapist and have promoted that. So just as I said about how people don't realize the impact that they have about just conversation wise, like why it's okay. You never know if someone is like, man, Dr. Anita Phillips said that it's okay to go to a therapist. I think I'm gonna try it out, because I trust her and I recognize that she's what? Wise counsel. In the Bible, it makes a notation of what wise counsel is, right? And so if you rely on someone, if you recognize that someone is of wise counsel and they do something that even if you're scared about it, you are more susceptible to go after it because wise counsel told you it was okay. Dr. Anita Phillips is wise counsel. You have a couple of other people who are wise counsel, right? Who are of the Christian faith. You have the Campbells, you have all of these people who are wise counsel. And so it is now becoming less of a taboo, less cliche, and more of a conversation piece regarding Christian perspective. One of the people that I respect the most on a Christian perspective in regards to mental health has to be Dr. Howard, right? From Alfred Street Baptist. The second that he vocally said that and what he was talking about was something called compassion fatigue, which means that you have been serving others so frequently, so much, that take a glass, if you will, and every time somebody walks up to you communion wise saying that they have something, you pour drops into their cup to the point where you don't have anything left. That level of burnout is specifically called compassion fatigue because you are made to have compassion, right? So when he vocalized and said he needed a break, I thought it was the most profound thing ever. But it also set the tone for the person who goes to his church who realistically feels like they need a break from work and they have the ability but won't hit the gas. He set the tone for Black men, right? Eliminating some type of level of masculine fragility, right? Of saying, hey, I need a break and I can't always be strong. So he set the bar so high, right? In regards to I need to take care of myself so I can take care of people. And that is also another reason why Christian folks need to pour into themselves so that they can help other people when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
mental health. So I think that's kind of like where the shift has been, when it comes to Christian perspective. Granted, there is a lot more education that's involved. There's a lot more exposure that's involved. There's a lot more um, uh, kind of like dated, perspective that needs to be involved in order for it to be kind of like a sweep across the board, if you will, about mental health counseling and being receptive to getting counseling. But we do have some I always call them God's foot angels. We do have some of God's foot angels available, right? Who have been spreading the gospel of what therapy has done for them, but what also
Mm-hmm.
what God has done for them. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my perspective.
I like that gospel angels.
Yeah, I'm one of God's foot angels. That's why I always joke. I have a couple of clients who specifically ask me for me to pray for them,
Mm-hmm.
or for me to take ideology from out of the Bible and incorporate it in their mental health. And mind you, I'm not a pastoral counselor,
Mm-hmm.
but I have it listed where I will tap into Christianity or spirituality, and I always tell them, like, I'm God's foot angel. Like, what do I need to do to
Mm-hmm.
help you, right? Like, I'm trying to help you. And so they acknowledge that, right? That I'm not in competition with God, but I'm a product of God just as they are.
It's good, like you said, balance. I know when I was looking for my therapist, I went to Safe Harbor, which is specifically like their Christian counseling.
Mm-hmm.
But the one thing that I liked about my counselor is that she offers a balance, and she gives you the option, like, do you want me to incorporate a Christian perspective into our counseling sessions, or, like, do you not? So she gives people that option to kind of have that balance. And I appreciated the fact that I was able to have that balance, that I was able to seek counseling from her. And if I wanted whatever the Christian perspective from it, she would give it to me. And if I didn't want that, she would give it to me on a
Mm-hmm.
just a different domain. So I think that balance is something that also can be very helpful for people.
Of course.
Okay, so we winding down. I have one more question for you, and then I want you to go back to those steps that you were talking about at the
Yeah,
end.
sure.
So my last question is in regards to just kind of individuals, when, or just people in general, when do you believe an individual should make the decision to seek counseling or some form of therapy? Like, do you think there is like a breaking point for some people, or like how do you think, like, when do you think is a good time for a person to make the decision to actually, like, seek counseling or therapy?
Yeah, I think every person needs to go to a therapist. So I feel like there's no specific time. I
Mhm.
know a lot of the times people reach out to therapy when they are at a breaking point, right? And so part of eliminating stigmas, not necessarily just for the Black community, but in general, is also the ideology that you don't go to a therapist when there's just something specifically wrong, right?
Mhm.
So if you have never had the notion of going to a clinician at any point, right, in any way, shape, form, or fashion, if you notice that there are aspects of you, right, that are not the same and that you cannot recognize what's going on, right? So, you're forgetful about a lot of things. Maybe you have imposter syndrome. You're very anxious on your job because you feel like they're going to find you out, right? And they're going to fire you. If you feel like your relationships is not in order, if you feel like you don't feel like yourself. And when people say that they don't feel like themselves, they realistically don't feel like themselves. If you're
Mhm.
used to getting up at 8 o'clock in the morning and putting on shoes and putting on makeup and having a good time and blasting your Jill Scott or your gospel CD, and that's not you. And now you're real somber. You're wearing all black, gray, white, just not being yourself, that there is something going on, right? And so if that is the marker for you, then of course go ahead and recognize who a counselor or a clinician could potentially be. But you don't have to wait until then, right? The reason why people are the way that it is the most impactful, right, is if that person has made an executive decision to go. I know that we have family members, we have cousins, we have aunties, we have people, right, that we know should be at somebody's, it should be, seeing a clinician for whatever
Mhm.
the reason is, right? And disclaimer, I believe everybody needs a counselor. But we can't force them to go, right? How many times have you known that somebody's like, yeah, my so and so need a therapist? I already talked to her. It has to be for that person, and that
Mm-hmm.
person has to make the executive decision. Because if not, that person becomes an involuntary client, and sometimes they're not receptive to the counseling, kind of like the counseling culture and the counseling procedures, and they're not receptive to it, and it doesn't assist with the healing process. So when someone is ready to see a counselor, of course, go ahead and do it. When someone feels like this is a time for them, whether they got insurance or they switch, living arrangements, or they have more time, of course, go and see somebody. And at this point, we're available to everybody 24 hours, 7 days a week almost, because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So if that person feels like they are able to go to counseling and they are willing to go to counseling, that's the time for them to go.
That when you were talking, it made me think of something. I know for a lot of people, cost is often a factor. They don't think they can afford it. Do you have any suggestions for people who, they may think that it's too expensive or something that they aren't going to be able to afford, being able to go to counseling?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for people in those types of situations?
Yeah, of course. So there's a couple of suggestions. The first suggestion would be that one, of course, option one is always like to use your insurance, right? So if you have insurance, whether private or through Medicaid or medical assistance, then of course use that. Option two, if you feel like your deductible is extremely too high, whatever the case may be, or even if you don't have insurance but you have EAP at your job, that one of the things people forget about is their EAP. So if your EAP allows you to see a clinician and they're going to pay for it, use it. If you do not have either option one or option two, there are other options. One of the alternative options is for you to see if like there's certain agencies that assist in the payment of services. I mentioned the Boris Henson Foundation a little bit earlier, which is a foundation that was sponsored by Taraji P. Henson, another Washington, D.C. native. And she sponsored this organization in remembrance of her father, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so she has taken the liberty of providing financial relief to people who want to see a mental health clinician right now. So I would suggest going onto that website and seeing if you could sign up, right? And so someone should be in touch with you and you can, go about getting mental health services there. Another way of doing it is some community agencies provide mental health counseling, right? So, you have, what is it, Bread for the City, or, they have organizations like that actually provide some level of mental health assistance to people. So mental health now is more accessible than ever. And so there are ways of going about receiving services that you don't necessarily have to have, private insurance. You can always tap into a couple of other outlets in order for you to get mental health services.
Thank you for that, Chanel.
You're welcome.
All right, and so let's go back to the steps that you were
Yeah.
talking about previously. You said you could talk about them at the end, so take it away, sister.
Yeah. So to obtain a counselor is, like I said, it's kind of like buying a pair of shoes, right? So you have a couple of ways. One of them is that if you receive like a referral from like a pamphlet or something like that, you can call them, right, and say, hey, you want to make an appointment. But if you didn't receive like a specific referral, there are websites that you can go onto where you can see the person, you could kind of get a feel for it. Like if you Google me, right, you'll see that I have a profile on Psychology Today. Psychology Today is one of the websites where you'll be able to see the counselor, and that they'll allow you to say, how much they charge, right, on a sliding scale, or a fee for service, or what insurances that they take. You can read about their theoretical orientation, which is very important because it's how they manage their time with you, right, and what techniques that they use.
Mm-hmm.
But they also should respond back, right? So you have the option. I know a lot of people don't like to talk on the phone. Sometimes they don't have the privacy to talk on the phone. Psychology Today gives you the option of typing an email and having that person, and you get to choose if you want a phone call back or email back, right? So that's very important. And then there's other websites therapy for Black girls is a very, very lucrative one, especially in the DC metropolitan area. Also, same platform. You can send an email, and that person can get back in contact with you. Other websites are like Good Therapy. There's an electronic platform called Talkspace, which is kind of like in a text format, if you will, where you could text your counselor back and forth, and it's at a flat rate fee. I want to say it's like $65 a month or something,
Mm-hmm.
and you could text the counselor back and forth, and maintain contact there. So there's various ways, but once you reach out to a counselor and that counselor reaches out to you, then you have some options yourself, right? Because they're not in control of your wellness. You are. So you can ask them questions. One of the questions that I always suggest people ask is, do you have experience in XYZ? So if you have anxiety, ask them, do they have experience servicing anxiety like clients? If you have borderline personality disorder, ask them what techniques do they use for their borderline personality disorder clients. If you want a counselor and maybe your area does not have a lot of counselors of color, and you find a counselor who you feel is suitable, who that person is not of color, and you want to reach out to them, you can ask them questions about cultural competency or cultural awareness to see if you guys are a fit. Sometimes they have consultations up from 10 to 15 minutes, which is free, where you can ask them these questions. Sometimes people allow Zoom meetings for the to kind of interview, etc. But you have options, and you can ask them what options that they have available for you, and make your decision from that.
Janae, you still there?
I'm sorry, said it. Yes, I am.
Okay, went out and I didn't. I was like, did it hang up on it? It did it because I couldn't hear you. I think the Wi-Fi was acting crazy.
Listen, you got the spirit of Teddy Riley on you. You got
Girl, listen, there's some Nelly going on over here. One of the two.
yeah,
I'm not sure what's happening.
Nelly Riley.
So before we wrap up, is there anything else just in regards to mental health that you wanted to share? Because I don't have any questions. You did an all-star job answering these questions.
No, just know that, as Black folks, it's time for us to start being in charge of our own wellness and our own emotional growth. And that sometimes we have allowed other people to be in charge of our emotional growth, right? And our emotional labeling, right? And we know that people have used those labels sometimes against us, for the worst. But when we educate ourselves, right, throwing around diagnoses like ADHD, and you got ADD, you got bipolar. Once we educate ourselves and experience a level of clarity when it comes to our diagnoses, we know how to manage, but we also know how to educate other people. And we also know how to protect ourselves. That's the last thing, right? Knowing about your mental health state is a form of protection. It does not make you more susceptible to endure a level of um, in hindsight. Black folks have always been stereotyped as one thing, right? And so that's going to continue to happen. That's the reason why we're more anxious than other minorities. However, if we educate ourselves, we can correct people about how they treat us regarding our disabilities, our mental health state. We can advocate for ourselves. So this is a level of autonomy that we're providing through mental health, right? Versus labeling or making someone feel bad about what they have, right? And I gave a very broad number about how many Black people are impacted, right? And so, helping ourselves and helping people help us, right, is something that we have control over. So I do advocate for mental health, and I do advocate for education. And so, if anybody ever has a question and they reach out to you after this podcast, I have no problem answering any type of questions. But yeah, just educate yourself on the mental health risk that could potentially be impacting you.
Thank you so much, Chanel, for doing this. I really appreciate it. Mental health is something that I am learning more and more about, and it's something that I'm interested in. But of course, I'm not as educated on it as you are. So that's why I didn't have much commentary. Normally I have commentary and I can go back and forth. But I didn't do that today because, I don't want to speak on things that I don't know about. So I try to let you talk and I just kind of listened and I was very receptive of everything that you had to say. And I really appreciate your knowledge and your expertise. You can just tell that you're so well versed in the area of counseling, in the area of mental health. And I'm so thankful that God has allowed you to be here for us, for the mark that you're leaving, not just on the mental health community, but for people of color in the mental health community. So thank you so much for your service and all that you are doing for us and people like us. It is so appreciative. And thank you. I want to give you your flowers while you're still here because I love
No,
you, girl.
don't be getting all sentimental now. I'm about to charge you. But no, you know, one, thank you, right? One, for the invitation, of course, but then two, for also creating this platform, right? Because not a lot of people want to talk about mental health. Not a lot of people want to ask appropriate questions. And as I stated earlier, someone potentially listening to this podcast could potentially get the notion of like, hey, like I really want to know more about mental health and I really want to know more about my own wellness. And so you could be the convincing factor that I said that eliminates the barrier. So this is not anything small. This is more so broadband, right? So when we think about trees and we think about growth, because trees are symbolic to growth, we think about how we expand ourselves and how we reach other people. And so the branches that you conveyed through this podcast is now touching other people. So you should definitely commemorate your own self, right? Because someone will be educated from this, someone will feel more comfortable about talking about it, whether they are Christian or they're not Christian, and hopefully they'll be able to receive the information in a good light, and then look forward to the mental health process.
Oh, thank you, Chanel. I do really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So, yep. So those are all of the questions that I had. I don't have anything else to add. You did a spectacular job. If you don't have anything else to add, we'll go ahead and wrap it up.
No, I think I'm good.
All right, that sounds good. So, if after listening to this, if anybody has any questions, any extra questions in regards to mental health, or if you need any type of assistance in searching for a counselor, or just need help in the steps to get you to who you need to get to, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and I can reach out. Go to Chanel, like on behalf to just kind of get you started and pair you with um, a mental health professional or counselor who can help you along your journey. So I truly thank you for taking the time, about an hour or so, out of your day just to listen to us have this much needed conversation. I hope it was rewarding and I hope that it was beneficial to you. Until next time, Gems, I will see you soon. Remember to keep shining bright. And remember to keep just being a light wherever you go. And remember to have compassion and kindness in this season because people need it. And they may be the only you may be the only Jesus that they see right now. So until next time, Gems, take care.